The case today I have for you starts just after 3 a.m. in Medellin, Colombia, July 2nd, 1994. A tall, well-dressed man walks alone through the car park of a dimly lit nightclub. He's just 27 years old, hands in his pockets, head down. A black Toyota SUV pulls up behind him. A voice shouts from the inside. The man turns, and then a gunshot. Then another and another, 6 bullets in total. After each one, the killer yells a single word: goal. Just like a goal had been scored, but this wasn't a game. This was the murder of Andrés Escobar, a beloved national hero, a footballer who tried to do the right thing in a country where doing the right thing could get you killed, and his only crime was scoring in the wrong net. This is the story of how one mistake at the World Cup led to one of the most shocking murders in sports history. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I would say pretty much everyone knows about the World Cup. Even if you have never watched it, even if you have no interest in it, you've probably heard about it. And if you were a football fan in the early 1990s, there was one team that had everyone's attention, and not just for how they played. Colombia. The country had just qualified for the 1994 FIFA World Cup in a dazzling fashion. They obliterated Argentina 5-0 in Buenos Aires. Commentators started throwing out wild predictions. Colombia could win the whole thing. But back home, Colombia wasn't just rising, it was boiling. The country was locked in a brutal, bloody war between drug cartels and the government. Pablo Escobar may have been dead, but the chaos he left behind was still alive and thriving. The cartel had splintered, and without a clear cartel in charge of criminal law and order, the city was out of control. But the money, that was very much still in circulation, and a lot of it had found its way into football. Colombian narcos saw football clubs as money laundering opportunities. During this era of narco football, drug money had turned Atletico into one of the best teams in South America. Football was no longer just a game, it was a political tool, a money laundering operation, a high-stakes business with lethal consequences for failure. And right in the centre of this storm was Andrés Escobar, nicknamed the Gentleman of Football. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't wild, he wasn't like the coke-fueled stars who partied until sunrise. He was calm, clean-cut, devoutly Catholic. Every morning before school, he would attend Mass with his mother. He believed in integrity and in discipline, in doing things the right way, even when the world around him wasn't playing by the same rules. But in Colombia in the 90s, doing things the right way could be dangerous. Andrés was part of the golden generation of Colombian football, but he was also walking a razor's edge, because when football becomes entangled with cartels, the line between sport and survival disappears. Behind the scenes of Colombia's football team, the pressure was suffocating. According to people who were quoted at the time, players were receiving threats, sometimes directly. Other times it was more subtle, maybe an envelope under the hotel room door, or even a phone call in the middle of the night. Rumours swirled that bets worth millions were being placed by cartel bosses on every single match, and the 1994 World Cup was a goldmine, but only if Colombia delivered. Which meant, if they didn't, someone was going to pay the price. Andrés had been offered a potential contract by AC Milan. He had a future in Europe. He was a symbol of hope, a clean player in a dirty game, but he was also trapped. He couldn't escape what was happening back home, none of them could. So, when Colombia boarded the plane to the US that summer, they weren't just chasing glory. They were running, and they knew it. It was June 22nd, 1994, at the Rose Bowl Stadium in Pasadena, California. 94,000 fans packed the stands. Colombia was playing their second group stage match against the US, and the pressure was on. Their opening match, a shock 3-1 defeat to Romania, had already put Colombia on thin ice. But behind the scenes, things were even worse. There were whispers that, back in Colombia, cartel bosses had lost serious money on that match. The Romanian defeat hadn't just been embarrassing, it had cost them. Players reported receiving threats. According to Colombian journalist Gonzalo Guillen, one teammate even got a call the night before the US match, telling him if he played badly again, his family would suffer. Can you imagine the absolute sick feeling you'd have? The pressure to win, because it's your job. If you're that high up in football, you've probably given everything to it. But then also on top of that, now add that pressure that your family's lives might be in danger if you don't do well at this game. And it very much was a game, but because of the money invested, I suppose, into it, it now was a matter of life or death. And the whole team was terrified. And so, onto this match, and it starts pretty normally as football matches go, and 34 minutes into the match, the US were on the attack. A midfielder took a low cross into the Colombian box. Andrés Escobar, composed, tactical, always precise, slid to intercept the ball, to deflect it away from an incoming striker. But it took a cruel touch off his boot, and the ball rolled past his own keeper and into the back of Colombia's net. Own goal. USA 1, Colombia 0. Watching this, you can see how quickly it all happens and how Andrés is obviously just trying to intercept that ball, but it doesn't go his way. It's a mistake. It could happen to any football player. The silence was instant. Then the stadium erupted. Colombia would go on to lose the match 2-1. They were eliminated from the tournament in the group stage, a humiliatingly early exit for a team that some had tipped to win the whole thing. And back home, the mood turned sinister. Journalists noticed something chilling. Almost immediately after the final whistle, a wave of threatening messages started circulating. Radio stations reported people calling in saying Andrés should die for what he'd done. Wild, but 100% true. Andrés flew home, but he didn't go into hiding. He wasn't that kind of a man. Instead, just 4 days after returning to Colombia, he wrote an open letter in El Tiempo, a national newspaper. He apologised to fans. He took full responsibility. And he ended it with a line that still haunts people to this day, quote, "Life doesn't end here." But for Andrés Escobar, it almost had. Because someone was watching, someone who hadn't forgiven, someone with money on the line, and a gun. It was the early hours of July 2nd, 1994, just 10 days after that fateful own goal. And for the first time since returning from the US, Andrés was going out. His fiancée had begged him not to go. She'd seen the letters, the phone calls, the death threats. Quote, "Just stay in just this once." But Andrés simply smiled and said, quote, "Nothing will happen." Because Andrés didn't live in fear. He was humble. He was also devout. He prayed every morning. He drove a modest car. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't chase women. He believed that goodness protected him. That night, he joined friends at El Indio, a polished bar where the wealthy and well-connected went to unwind. Music played softly, the waiters knew their names, cocktails clinked against glass. Outside, the city sweltered with tension, a pressure cooker of political unrest, narco-violence and public fury. But inside that restaurant, Andrés probably felt normal again because he did not know that he was being watched. Later that night, the group drifted to El Padrote, this glitzy nightclub tucked into the Las Palmas hills, known for its panoramic views and punters with expensive taste and often dangerous connections. Inside, the music thumped. Andrés tried to blend in, but there was no hiding. He was instantly recognised. The tall, well-known centre-back with thoughtful eyes. Colombia's number 2. The man who'd once given an entire country hope. He smiled politely, shook hands, probably tried to ignore the whispers. But in that crowd was another group. Men who weren't there to dance or unwind. They were watching him, just waiting. And among them was Humberto Munoz Castro, a bodyguard. Not high-ranking, but loyal to men who were. And those men were the Gallon brothers, businessmen with deep pockets and even deeper connections to the underworld. They had money riding on that match, a lot of money. And when Colombia lost to the US, thanks to what they saw as one fatal deflection, it wasn't just national pride that died. It was power and profit and reputation, and now, right in front of them, stood the man who they believed cost them everything. At around 3 a.m, in the car park of that nightclub, Andrés was walking back to his car when he ran into Humberto Munoz Castro. Words were exchanged, heated ones. Witnesses said that the man began taunting Andrés, mocking the own goal, laughing, jeering, saying things like, quote, "Thanks for the goal." Andrés wasn't confrontational, he never had been. Witnesses say that at this point he raised his hand in a quiet gesture, maybe a wave, maybe a peace offering. Maybe he was trying to walk away. But Humberto, the bodyguard for the Gallon brothers, stepped forward. He pulled out a .38 caliber pistol. And then a bang. And then more, over and over again. 6 shots struck Andrés. He collapsed next to his car. Blood pooled under his crisp white shirt, and his friends screamed for help. Someone called for an ambulance, but by the time he was rushed to the hospital general, it was far too late. Andrés Escobar was pronounced dead at 3:45 a.m. He was just 27 years old. The news hit Colombia hard. It's reported that people openly wept in the streets. Newspapers ran his photo with black borders. Thousands lined the road for his funeral. And when I say that, I should be more specific. It was more than 120,000 people that attended his funeral. And I checked that number. That is how much he affected people. More mourners than there were who went to the actual game, the US versus Colombia game. Andrés had been a symbol of everything Colombia wanted to be. Dignified, honest, composed. And now he was gone, shot over an own goal. It seemed senseless, but in 1990s Colombia, nothing was truly senseless. This was a country held hostage by narco money, by corruption, and this long shadow cast by Pablo Escobar's fallen empire. Matches weren't just matches, they were investments, and Andrés' mistake had cost someone millions. In the early hours of July 2nd, as the blood on the pavement outside the nightclub began to dry, the police launched what they called an urgent investigation. But urgent in 1990s Colombia, that meant something very different. Witnesses had seen everything. There was no mystery about who pulled the trigger. Humberto Munoz Castro, the 30-year-old bodyguard to 2 of the most well-connected men in the city. And Humberto hadn't gone far. In fact, he was found hiding out at a local finca, which, from my understanding, is basically like a rural estate, the kind often used by people who know how to disappear when things go wrong. At first, Humberto began to plot an alibi and said that his boss's van had been stolen, so it couldn't have been him or the Gallon brothers. But there were witnesses of the murder, and they described the characteristics of the van to the authorities investigating the case. And they soon discovered the stolen van story was a lie, and so Humberto surrendered quietly, almost too quietly, like someone who knew he had pretty much no other choice. Not because the police had found him, but because he wasn't about to throw anyone else under the bus. When they brought Humberto in, he confessed, quote, "We argued, things got heated, I shot him." But Humberto hadn't been alone that night. When he fled the scene, he got into a car, a shiny SUV that sped off into the dark streets. And inside that vehicle were Juan, Santiago, and Pedro David Gallon, his bosses. The two brothers we know of having alleged ties to drug trafficking, gambling, and paramilitary groups. The Gallon brothers told police they had nothing to do with the shooting, that they'd been surprised, shocked even, that they just drove Humberto away because they were scared. And just like that story was all they needed to walk away. And prosecutors did not push. No deeper charges, no conspiracy theories explored, no Gallon brothers in court, no mention of gambling debts, no question about whether someone had lost a fortune on Colombia's elimination, or whether Andrés Escobar's mistake had cost a kingpin millions. Humberto took it all: the motive, the blame, the weight of national grief. And the court handed him 43 years in prison, but it was never going to be as simple as that. Humberto did not serve 43 years. He didn't even serve half. In 2005, just 11 years later, he walked free. He got an early release for good behaviour, so he served 11 years for murder. To this day, many believe that Andrés' murder wasn't about pride or passion or rage. It was very simply about money and power. On paper, the Gallon brothers were just successful cattle ranchers, rich, well-dressed, known in the upper circles, but behind closed doors, and what has actually come out officially later on, is that these guys weren't just raising cows. They were allegedly neck deep in the underworld, not just connected to this criminal organisation, La Oficina de Envigado, but they were the ones bankrolling it. Now, La Oficina wasn't your average cartel. This thing started out as Pablo Escobar's personal enforcement squad, but after his death, it mutated. It didn't die off like people might have hoped. Instead, it evolved. If something shady went down in the 90s, then chances are La Oficina either orchestrated it or allowed it. And their power was concentrated right in the centre, in the city Andrés called home. And I've got to admit, in researching this case, I found that there wasn't a huge amount of information on the brothers or their convictions or crimes that they were accused of after this time. But what I did find was that in 2014, so over a decade after Andrés' murder, the US Treasury Department officially named both the Gallon brothers as narcotics traffickers under the Kingpin Act. That's the same designation used for major global drug lords. This tells us something. These definitely weren't bystanders. Something we suspected is that they were the shot callers. And since then, they have been in and out of prison numerous times, but never for anything related to Andrés' murder. The world looked at Colombia and saw a football tragedy, but inside the country, people saw something else. They saw what it meant to lose hope. They saw how the powerful stay protected, while the good die young. Andrés Escobar was polite, gentle. He basically was this man who wanted to bring dignity to a sport that was poisoned by blood money and these backroom deals. He had tried to rise above it, but in 1994 Colombia, goodness wasn't necessarily armour, it was much more of a target. Andrés became a symbol, but not just of loss, of warning, because in places ruled by shadow economies and guns, sometimes the loudest message does come from a bullet. And somehow, I had never heard of this case, or of Andrés. Maybe because that's the year I was born. I obviously wasn't very conscious of what was going on that year, but having learned a bit about it now, I would have thought that somewhere down the line it'd be more well known. We didn't hear about this in school, not in football, not in any headlines, but I had heard of the Gallon brothers. Again, maybe that's because my job is true crime. But the things I'd heard of were mainly that Juan Santiago had been accused of hiding cocaine in animal food, fertilizers, and then he tried to send it to Europe. But that was a few years ago now. Oh, and there was talk of him being extradited to the US, but to be honest, it is all a big mess. I read about a special US immigration agent who was bribed by a former member of the Cali cartel. They got confidential information. And that meant that there was a dismissal of a lawsuit against a Colombian kingpin, Jose Bayron Piedranjita. So it's corrupt and justice seems far away from the reality. And maybe that is the final tragedy, that in a world full of villains, the heroes don't always make the history books. And I know that maybe I have a blind spot not being a football fan, but everyone that I have spoken to about this case, the only person who knew about this was my partner, who is like a super massive football fan. We see this all the time with Red Rum. There's usually way more info out there about the perpetrators, and it's often really hard to find information about the victims, about their stories. And I guess, if anything, this case just really shows that too. So as I leave you today, please just remember one name in this case. Remember Andrés Escobar.